Before we begin, close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it out even more slowly than you took it in. Feel the surface beneath you. Let your body become heavy. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open. Fingers loose. Let the tension in your jaw release. Let the day, whatever it held, begin to drift away like smoke rising from a dying fire. Tonight, we are going to a place you have never been. A place that no living person has ever been. Because it no longer exists, not in the form it once had, not with the life it once contained. We are going to an island. A beautiful island in the middle of a sea so blue it almost hurts to look at. An island of olive groves and cypress trees and mountain peaks capped with snow in winter and baked golden in summer. An island where the air smells of salt and wild thyme and the particular warmth of sun on white stone. The island is called Crete, and on it, for 1,000 years ago, something extraordinary was happening. A civilization was at its peak. Not a civilization of war. Not a civilization built on conquest and slavery and the fear of angry gods demanding blood. Something rarer, something more surprising. Something that, when archaeologists first uncovered it at the very beginning of the 20th century, seemed almost too good to be true. A civilization of beauty, of art and trade and sailing and dancing and sophisticated plumbing and multi-story, palaces and elegant painted pottery and a writing system we still cannot fully read. A civilization where women held prominent positions in society, in religion, in public life. A civilization with no defensive walls around its cities. Because for centuries, perhaps longer, it lived without the constant threat of invasion that shaped every other ancient world we know. The Minoans. You were almost certainly never taught about them in school. They do not feature in most history curricula. They are not as famous as the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans. They left no famous battles, no conquering generals, no empires built on subjugated peoples. They left art and architecture and trade networks and story because they are gone. And we do not fully know why. Tonight, we find out who they were. Breathe slowly. Let the warmth of the Mediterranean find you, even here, even now. And let me take you back for 1,000 years to the most beautiful civilization the ancient world ever produced. The island at the center of the world. Crete. Let me describe Crete to you, because the island itself shaped everything the Minoans became. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands. Sitting at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, it is roughly 260 kilometers long and between. 12 and 60 kilometers wide, along. Mountainous sliver of land between the Aegean to the north and the Libyan Sea to the south. The mountains are the first thing you notice. 3 great mountain massifs run across the island like a spine, the White Mountains in the west, Mount Ida in the center, and the Dictee Range in the east. Mount Ida rises to nearly 2,500 meters. in ancient legend. It was the birthplace of Zeus. The cave where his mother hid him from his father Cronos is still shown to visitors today on its eastern flank. These mountains are not merely scenery. They shaped Minoan life profoundly. They caught the rain and snow that fed the rivers and springs of the coastal plains. They provided timber, cypress and pine and cedar for the extraordinary Minoan fleet. They created microclimates of extraordinary variety, so that within a single island you could find every kind of Mediterranean landscape, from alpine meadows to subtropical coastal lowlands. The coastline is endlessly varied. Dramatic cliffs plunging directly into deep water. Wide sandy bays where rivers meet the sea. Natural harbours sheltered by headlands. The Minoans, as we will see, were sailors of the first order, and Crete gave them everything sailors need: timber for ships, harbours for shelter, prevailing wains that connected them to Egypt in the south, to the Aegean islands in the north, to mainland Greece in the northwest, to Cyprus and the Levant in the east. Crete sits at the crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean world, and the Minoans used that position with a sophistication and energy that created the first true maritime civilization in history. Before the Minoans, people have lived on Crete for a very long time. The earliest evidence of human habitation dates to approximately 130,000 years ago. Evidence of Neanderthals or their contemporaries reaching the island by sea, which itself implies a level of seafaring capability far earlier than was once assumed. The first modern humans arrived on Crete approximately 10,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers, bringing with them the agricultural package of wheat and barley, sheep and goats, cattle and pigs. They came from Anatolia, most likely the western edge of what is today Turkey, crossing the Aegean in small boats. Island hopping their way south. These early Cretan farmers settled on the coastal plains, and in the river valleys they built villages. They farmed and herded. They made pottery. They buried their dead in communal tombs. For thousands of years they were, in archaeological terms, unremarkable, capable and adapted, certainly, but not yet what the Minoans would become. Then, somewhere around 3000 BC to 5000 years ago, something began to change. Trade connections multiplied. Contact with Egypt intensified. The Cycladic islands to the north were producing extraordinary art, the famous marble figurines, and trading widely across the Aegean. Copper was coming from Cyprus, obsidian from the volcanic island of Melos, gold from sources further afield. The Aegean was becoming a network, and Crete, sitting at its southern hub, was becoming the network's most important node. By around 2700 BC, the first signs of what we call Minoan civilization are clearly visible in the archaeological record: larger settlements, more complex pottery, evidence of specialized crafts, the beginning of a social complexity that would, over the next 1,000 years, produce something the ancient world had never seen before. Palaces. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the images come gently. White stone, blue sea, the smell of time on a warm wind. Around 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, the Minoans built their first palaces. Not palaces in the sense we usually mean the word, not fortresses for warrior kings. Surrounded by walls and moats and guards with weapons. The Minoan palaces were something entirely different. Something that reflects a different set of values. A different understanding of what power meant and how it should be displayed. The palaces were centers. Administrative centers, economic centers, religious centers, artistic centers. They were the hubs around which Minoan civilization organized itself, the places where goods were collected and redistributed, where craftsmen worked, where religious ceremonies were performed, where the records were kept. And they were beautiful. Extraordinarily, breathtakingly beautiful. The greatest of them was Knossos on the northern coast of Crete, a few kilometers inland from the modern city of Heraklion. At its peak, Knossos covered an area of approximately 22,000 square meters. It had perhaps 1,500 rooms. It rose to 4 or 5 stories in places. It had a sophisticated drainage and plumbing system, clay pipes carrying fresh water in and waste water out. That would not be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. The walls of Knossos were covered in paintings. Brilliant, vivid, joyful paintings in the true fresco technique, pigment applied to wet plaster so that the colors are locked permanently into the wall itself. Dolphins leaping through blue water. Partridges and hoopoes in a garden landscape. Young men and women leaping over the backs of charging bulls. Processions of elegant figures carrying offerings. Landscapes of lily and crocuses and sea creatures rendered with a freshness and naturalistic delight that feels almost shockingly modern. Standing in front of a Minoan fresco, you do not feel the distance of 4,000 years. You feel the presence of the people who made it, their joy in the natural world, their delight in color and movement and life. They were artists of extraordinary gifts, and they decorated every surface of their world with the evidence of those gifts, the layout of a palace. Let me walk you through Knossos, slowly, as if we are there together. In the warm afternoon light of a Cretan summer, with the smell of the sea on the breeze. We enter through the west court, a wide paved area open to the sky, where public gatherings and ceremonies may have taken place. Pits in the pavement here, coolers, they are called, may have been used for storage of sacred or important materials. We pass through a propylon, a formal gateway, and enter the western wing of the palace. This is where the administrative and storage functions are concentrated. Long, narrow magazines, storerooms line either side of a central corridor. Some still contain the giant clay storage vessels called pithoi, taller than a person, once full of olive oil or grain or wine. We move deeper into the palace, through corridors and light wells, open shafts built into the structure to bring daylight and fresh air into the interior rooms. This is sophisticated architecture. The Minoans understood that large buildings need ventilation and light, and they designed their palaces accordingly. We arrive at the central court. This is the heart of every Minoan palace, a large rectangular open space oriented north to south, around which all the major rooms are arranged. The central court at Knossos is approximately 60 meters long and 30 meters wide. It is paved in white gypsum. The surrounding walls, multi-storied, create a sense of enclosure and grandeur. This is where the bull leaping may have taken place. More on that later. We move to the east wing. Here are the more private spaces, what the excavator Arthur Evans called the domestic quarter. A grand staircase, one of the most impressive pieces of architecture in the ancient Aegean, descends through for stories. Light wells illuminate each level. The rooms are elegant, gypsum-panelled, fresco-decorated, furnished with stone benches and stone-lined basins. The Queen's Megaron, her main reception room, is decorated with a famous fresco of dolphins and fish. Their colours still vivid after 4,000 years. A connecting bathroom contains a clay bathtub shaped remarkably like a modern one. It is impossible to walk through Knossos, even in its current partially restored state, without feeling that the people who lived here were not so very different from us. Not in their desire for beauty. Not in their desire for comfort and light and running water and elegant spaces. They were, in the ways that matter most, recognizably human. The Minoan world, a society unlike any other. Here is what makes the Minoans truly extraordinary, truly different from every other ancient civilization we know. They were, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, a society in which women held central, prominent, honored positions. Let me be careful here. We cannot read Minoan linear, a script, the writing system they used for administrative records. We cannot hear their language. We cannot access their laws or their literature or their philosophy. Everything we know about Minoan society comes from the material remains, the art, the architecture, the objects found in graves and in palace storerooms. And from that material evidence, a picture emerges that is unlike anything else in the ancient world. In Minoan art, women are everywhere. They are the central figures in religious ceremonies, the ones who handle sacred objects, viha or pour libations who communicate with the divine. In the grand procession frescoes, women lead. In the images of outdoor gatherings, the so-called sacred conversations in the landscape, women are the participants. The great Minoan deity, the figure who appears most frequently and most prominently in religious contexts, appears to be female, a goddess, sometimes shown with snakes, sometimes with birds, sometimes simply as a powerful female presence receiving offerings. This is not to say the Minoans were a matriarchy in some simple sense. We cannot know enough to make that claim with confidence. But it is to say that Minoan society accorded women a visibility, a dignity, and a sacred importance that has no parallel in the ancient Near East, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in any of the other great civilizations of the Bronze Age. Women in Minoan art are depicted with the same vitality and presence as men. They participate in the same activities: the bull leaping, the outdoor gatherings, the religious ceremonies. They are shown in elaborate, beautiful clothing, not as passive objects of display, but as active agents in their world. Something different was happening on Crete, something that, in the context of the ancient world, feels almost revolutionary. The art of the Minoans. Let your breathing slow. Let the colors come, the vivid blues and reds and yellows of Minoan painting. The gleam of gold in Minoan jewelry, the delicate painted surfaces of Minoan pottery. Minoan art is unlike anything else produced in the ancient world. It is full of movement, full of nature, full of joy. The frescoes are the most famous expressions of Minoan artistic genius, but they are far from the only ones. The pottery is extraordinary. Minoan ceramic tradition went through several phases, each one technically and aesthetically more accomplished than the last. The marine-style pottery of the late Minoan period, dating to around 1500 BC, is perhaps the peak achievement. On these vessels, painted in dark pigment on a light background, the entire repertoire of the Aegean sea world unfolds. Octopuses with tentacles that wrap around the vessel, flying fish, sea anemones and corals and rocks and shells rendered with a naturalistic delight that makes them look almost alive. The Minoans were the first culture in history to make the sea itself, its creatures, its moods, its depths, a central subject of artistic expression. This is not coincidental. They were sailors, they knew the sea intimately, and their art reflects that intimate, loving knowledge. The goldwork is breathtaking. The famous Aegina treasure, found on the island of Aegina, but almost certainly of Minoan origin, includes pieces of such delicacy and technical sophistication that modern goldsmiths marvel at them. Miniature figures, animals in motion, complex granulation and filigree work that requires magnification to fully appreciate, produced by craftsmen working without any optical aid, guided only by extraordinarily trained eyes and hands. The carved seal stones, tiny gems of agate and jasper and rock crystal, no larger than a thumbnail, are carved with images of such precision and life that they seem almost impossible. Bulls in motion, griffins and sphinx, sacred symbols, ritual scenes, all rendered in a space no bigger than a fingernail, with a skill that defies easy explanation. The Minoans made beautiful things because beauty mattered to them, profoundly, centrally, as a value in itself. The bull and the leap. Of all the images in Minoan art, one is most famous, most discussed, most mysterious: the bull leaper. The image appears in multiple forms, in frescoes, on carved ivory, in bronze figurines, always the same subject: a massive charging bull. Its body shown in the flying, gallop position beloved of ancient artists, all for legs extended, the body fully stretched, and on and around the bull, human figures, performing extraordinary acrobatic feats. The most famous depiction, from a fresco at Knossos shows 3 figures conventionally interpreted as 2 women and a man, distinguished by skin color in the Minoan artistic convention where women are shown with white skin and men with red-brown. One figure grasps the bull's horns at the front. The central figure is airborne above the bull's back, apparently having just somersaulted over it. The third figure stands behind the bull with arms raised, apparently ready to catch. Was ist real? Did the Minoans actually leap over charging bulls? It sounds impossible. And many scholars have argued that the images are symbolic rather than literal, that they represent a mythological or religious concept, rather than an actual athletic practice. But others argue that it was real. Experimental work with bulls has shown that the instinctive response of a charging bull to toss its head upward at the moment of impact could theoretically launch a practiced athlete into the air. And the images are too consistent, too specific in their detail, to be purely symbolic. Whether literal or symbolic, the bull was central to Minoan religion and identity. Bull horns, the so-called horns of consecration, appear everywhere in Minoan sacred contexts. On palace walls, on shrine models, as actual stone or clay architectural elements crowning sacred buildings. The bull was power, the bull was the divine. And the Minoans, in their art, showed humans engaging with that power not in fear, not in submission, but in a kind of joyful, athletic defiance, leaping over the thing that could kill you. That is a very Minoan idea. Trade and the sea. The Minoans were the greatest maritime traders of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, possibly of any era in the ancient Mediterranean before the Phoenicians. Their trade networks, until their peak stretched from Egypt in the south to mainland Greece and the Cyclades in the north and northwest, to Cyprus and the Levant in the east, to Sicily and perhaps Sardinia in the west. Minoan pottery and other goods have been found across this entire arc. Egyptian tomb paintings from around 1500 BC show figures bringing Aegean-style goods to the pharaoh figures whom Egyptologists identify as Keftiu, their name for the Minoans. What did the Minoans trade? Olive oil, almost certainly. Crete was a major olive oil producer, and the great storage magazines of the palaces were full of oil pithoi, wine, wool and textiles, timber, pottery, both for its own sake and as containers for other goods. Possibly purple dye, produced from the murex sea snail. In return, they received copper from Cyprus, essential for bronze production, and therefore for tools and weapons and the entire Bronze Age economy. Gold and ivory from Egypt and the Levant. Tin, probably from sources in Afghanistan or Anatolia, also essential for bronze. Precious stones. Ideas and artistic influences that enriched and diversified Minoan culture. The Minoan fleet was the instrument of all this. Sophisticated sailing vessels capable of navigating the open Aegean and beyond. We know them from representations on pottery and seal stones, long. Low ships with sails and oars designed for speed and cargo capacity, The sea was not a barrier to the Minoans. It was a highway, a means of connection, a source of wealth and contact, and the endlessly stimulating exchange of goods and ideas that kept Minoan civilization fresh and inventive for 1,000 years. Religion and the sacred. The religious life of the Minoans is one of the most discussed and least resolved topics in Aegean archaeology. Because we cannot read their texts, we cannot access their theology directly. We can only observe their ritual objects and spaces and try to read meaning from them. What we can say is that Minoan religion was intimately connected to the natural world. Sacred spaces were often outdoors, peak sanctuaries on mountaintops, cave shrines in the limestone hills, sacred groves of trees. The Minoans did not primarily worship in enclosed temples. They worshipped in the landscape itself, in the places where the divine seemed most present, the high places, the deep places, the liminal zones between the human world and something larger. The great goddess, whatever her name was, which we do not know, was associated with multiple aspects of the natural world. With snakes, which appear in the famous snake goddess figurines found at Knossos. With birds, which appear as her attendants or manifestations in multiple artistic contexts. With trees, which had a sacred significance suggested by the many depictions of tree-pulling rituals in Minoan art. She was a goddess of nature, of fertility and wildness and the powers that govern the living world. There were also male divine figures, a young male god associated with the bull, perhaps, and with athletic and heroic qualities. But in the visual hierarchy of Minoan religion, the female principle appears dominant. The double axe, the labares, was the most sacred symbol of Minoan religion. It appears everywhere, carved in stone, cast in bronze, painted on walls, incised on pottery. Its exact meaning is unknown, but its ubiquity suggests a central importance. The word labyrinth may derive from Labares, the house of the double axe, and the labyrinth of Greek mythology. The maze beneath Knossos, where the Minotaur lived, may be a distant, distorted memory of the palace's complex layout. The people. What they looked like. Who were the Minoans as people? What did they look like? How did they dress? From the frescoes, we get a remarkably vivid picture. They were relatively slight, athletic people, slender waists, broad shoulder, long dark hair. Both men and women are shown with elaborate hairstyles, long ringlets falling to the shoulders. Hair pinned up in complex arrangements, decorated with beads and ornaments. The clothing is striking. Women wore elaborate, structured garments, fitted bodices, sometimes open at the front, with flounced skirts that could reach the ground. The skirts were decorated with patterns and colors of great complexity. Men wore loincloths or short kilts. Both sexes wore jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, elaborate headdresses for ceremonial occasions. The Minoans paid extraordinary attention to personal appearance. The frescoes show people who are conscious of how they look, who have invested care and skill in the way they present themselves to the world. This is not vanity exactly. It is more like an expression of the same aesthetic sensibility that produced the great frescoes and the marine-style pottery. A belief that the surface of things matters, that beauty in the world, including the human world, is worth cultivating. Daily life. Let your body sink a little deeper into rest. Let the images be quiet and warm, the smell of the sea, the warmth of Cretan sun, the sound of a city going about its daily life. What was daily life like for an ordinary Minoan? We can reconstruct something of it from the archaeological evidence, though with appropriate humility. The evidence is always partial, always skewed toward the wealthy and the ceremonial. Most Minoans lived in towns and villages rather than in or immediately adjacent to the great palaces. These settlements have been excavated at multiple sites around Crete. The houses were multi-roomed, sometimes multi-storied, built of stone and mud brick. They had flat roofs that could be used as additional living space. Some had internal staircases. Some had separate storage areas. The town of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, the island now called Santorini, which had close connections to Minoan Crete, gives us a particularly vivid picture of a Bronze Age. Aegean town because it was buried intact by volcanic ash around 1628 BC, like a Minoan Pompeii. The houses of Akrotiri are tall and well-built, with large windows, elaborate drainage systems, and walls decorated with frescoes of stunning quality, even in ordinary private houses, not just palaces. The people of Akrotiri had comfortable, even luxurious lives by ancient standards. They had furniture, stone benches, and wooden tables and beds. They had sophisticated pottery for cooking, storage, and serving food. They had oil lamps for light. They had access to a wide range of foods, seafood, of course, but also grain, legumes, olives, grapes, figs, perhaps meat from domesticated and wild animals. They were literate, or at least some of them were. The Linear A script appears not only on palace administrative tablets but on personal possessions painted or incised on pottery, on metal objects, on stone. Writing was not exclusively a palace technology in Minoan Crete. They were connected to the wider world. The trade networks meant that exotic materials and ideas reached ordinary people as well as palaces. Egyptian influence is visible in Minoan art and crafts. Cycladic connections are clear. The Minoans were cosmopolitan, aware of and engaged with the broader Mediterranean world. Music and celebration. The Minoans celebrated. This is clear from the art, even if we cannot hear the music or see the movement. Musical instruments appear in Minoan art: lyres, harps, a kind of sistrum or rattle, double flutes. Music was part of ceremony and possibly of daily life. The frescoes show gatherings that feel like celebrations, crowds of figures watching or participating in events in the central courts of palaces and in outdoor settings. The famous Grand Stand fresco from Knossos, though surviving only in fragments, seems to show large crowds gathered around the central court, spectators at some kind of public performance or ceremony. The camp stool fresco shows elegant figures, possibly including visitors or dignitaries seated and engaged in what appears to be a kind of ceremonial feast or gathering. There is something almost festive about it, even across 4,000 years. Processions appear frequently. Long lines of figures, richly dressed, carrying offerings, vessels of oil or wine, animals, plants, sacred objects, moving toward something, participating in something communal and significant. The Minoans gathered together for shared experience. They marked time with ceremony. They celebrated the seasons, the divine, the community itself. In this, they were entirely human, and in the specifics of how they celebrated, with beauty, with elegance, with a joy in the natural world that infuses every image they left us. They were distinctively, unmistakably themselves. C'est discovery. The man who found Gnosis in the spring of 1900, or wealthy. British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating a low hill near the modern city of Heraklion in northern Crete. He had been interested in the site for years. Locals had been finding carved seal stones, the tiny engraved gems, in the fields around the hill for decades. And Evans had collected some of them in his travels. He was convinced, based on those seals and on earlier exploratory work, that something significant lay beneath the hill. He had no idea how significant. Within the first week of excavation, his workers began uncovering the remains of a large building, walls, floors, pottery, and, almost immediately, the frescoes. Evans excavated Gnosis for the next 35 years. What he found transformed our understanding of European prehistory. Here was a Bronze Age civilization of the first order, sophisticated, artistic, literate, extensive, that had been completely unknown to modern scholarship. A civilization older than classical Greece, older than most of what we called the Greek world, whose existence had survived only in the distorted echoes of Greek mythology. Evans named them the Minoans, after Minos, the legendary king of Crete, son of Zeus and Europa, in whose palace beneath the labyrinth the Minotaur was imprisoned. The name stuck, though we do not know what the Minoans called themselves. Evans's excavation and reconstruction of Gnosis remains controversial. He made decisions about how to interpret what he found, about how to restore and reconstruct damaged frescoes and architectural elements that later archaeologists have questioned sharply. Some of his restorations are now believed to be significantly inaccurate. Some of his interpretive frameworks, his ideas about Minoan social organization, about the role of the palace, about what specific images meant, have been revised or rejected. But his essential discovery stands. There was a great civilization here. It was real. It was extraordinary. And it had been forgotten for 3,000 years. Linear A, the script we cannot read. Of all the frustrations of Minoan scholarship, none is greater than this. The Minoans had a writing system. They used it extensively on clay tablets, on pottery, on stone, on metal. And we cannot read it. Linear A, as it is called, to distinguish it from the later, related Linear B script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, consists of approximately 45 to 55 signs representing syllables, plus a larger set of logograms representing specific objects or commodities. It was used primarily for administrative purposes, keeping records of goods received and distributed, tracking inventories, recording transactions. Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek script that derived from Linear A, was deciphered in 1952 by a young British architect named Michael Ventris, one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. Ventris showed that Linear B represented an early form of Greek, and suddenly the administrative tablets of the Mycenaean palaces became readable. But Linear A, the parent script, remains undeciphered. And the reason is fundamental. We do not know what language the Minoans spoke. If we knew the language, if we could say with confidence that Minoan belongs to this or that language family, related to these or those known languages, then decipherment would be much more tractable. But Minoan appears to be an isolate, a language with no known relatives belonging to no identified language family. The Minoans spoke a language that died with them, and without knowing that language, their script remains locked. This is the deepest mystery of Minoan civilization. They wrote things down. They had thoughts and beliefs and records and perhaps stories and poetry. And we cannot access any of it. They are present in their art and their architecture and their material objects, vividly and compellingly present. But their words are silent. The eruption of Thera, around 1628 BC, the exact date is debated. But somewhere in the 17th century BC, the island of Thera, approximately 110 kilometers north of Crete, exploded. The Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The eruption was of a magnitude comparable to or exceeding Krakatoa in 1883, perhaps for times as powerful. The island, which had been the site of the thriving town of Akrotiri, was largely destroyed. A caldera, a collapsed volcanic crater, formed where the center of the island had been, now filled with water to form the beautiful curved bay of modern Santorini. The effects on Crete, 110 kilometers to the south, would have been severe: ash falls, possible tsunami, disruption of trade routes, possible damage to coastal settlements. For many years, it was popular to link the Thera eruption directly to the decline of Minoan civilization, to suggest that this catastrophic volcanic event was the blow that ended the Minoans. Some even connected it to the legend of Atlantis, the sudden, catastrophic disappearance of an advanced island civilization recorded by Plato, which he claimed to have inherited from Egyptian sources. But the chronology does not support a simple causal link. The Minoan palatial civilization did not immediately collapse after the Thera eruption. There is evidence of disruption and rebuilding, certainly, but the great palaces of Crete continued to function. Knossos in particular shows evidence of continuous occupation and use for perhaps another 200 years after the eruption. The Thera eruption was a trauma, a significant blow to a civilization that depended heavily on maritime, trade, and coastal infrastructure. But it was not, by itself, the end. The coming of the Mycenaeans. The end, when it came, arrived from the mainland. The Mycenaeans were a Greek-speaking people who had been developing their own palace civilization on the Greek mainland, at sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos during the same period that the Minoans were at their height on Crete. The relationship between the two civilizations was complex and long-standing. The Mycenaeans had absorbed enormous amounts of Minoan influence in religion, in technology. The early Mycenaean world is sometimes described as heavily Minoanized. But the Mycenaeans were not the Minoans. They were a more martial culture. Their palaces were fortified. Their art celebrated warriors and hunting and the power of arms in ways that Minoan art did not. They were, in the vocabulary of the Bronze Age, a warrior aristocracy. Around 1450 BC, approximately 2 centuries after the Thera eruption, something dramatic happened on Crete. Many of the Minoan palaces were destroyed. The destruction was widespread and roughly simultaneous, which suggests a coordinated attack rather than random accidents. The evidence points to the Mycenaeans. After the destruction, the palace of Knossos continued to function, but now in a different way. The administrative records from the final phase of Knossos are written not in Linear A but in Linear B, the script that Michael Ventris showed was early Greek, Mycenaean Greek. The Mycenaeans had taken control of Knossos. And with that takeover, Minoan civilization, as a distinct, independent, self-directed thing, effectively ended. Knossos itself was finally destroyed around 1375 BC, in circumstances that remain unclear. After that, there was no revival. The great palace was never rebuilt. The site continued to be occupied, but as a much smaller, much less significant settlement. The Minoan civilization, the civilization of frescoes and bull-leaping and snake, goddesses and marine-style pottery and undefended cities and female-centered religion, was over. What survived, but nothing ever entirely ends. The Mycenaeans, in conquering the Minoans, absorbed them. The Linear B tablets show Minoan names persisting alongside Greek names. Minoan religious symbols, the double axe, the horns of consecration appear in Mycenaean religious contexts. Minoan artistic traditions influenced Mycenaean art so profoundly that distinguishing between the two is sometimes genuinely difficult. And the Mycenaeans, in turn, fed their memories and their mythology into the later Greek tradition, the tradition of Homer and Hesiod, of the Olympian gods and the great myths that became the foundation of Western culture. The bull leaping may have become the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. The great palace of Knossos may have become the labyrinth. The Minoan goddess may have become incorporated into the Greek pantheon in Artemis, in Demeter, in the particular character of the goddess Athena, patron of crafts and wisdom rather than war. The Minoans disappeared as a civilization, but they did not disappear from human memory. They became myth. They became the dim, half-remembered golden age that the Greeks sometimes called the age before the heroes, a time when things were different, when the world was closer to the divine. And then, in the spring of 1900, Arthur Evans put his spade in the ground at Knossos. And they came back. What they teach us? A different way. I want to sit with something for a moment as you drift toward sleep. The Minoans built no walls around their cities. For centuries, the entire height of their civilization, their great palace centers were undefended, no fortifications, no moats, no towers. This is extraordinary in the ancient world. Every other major Bronze Age civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, invested enormously in defensive architecture. The walls of Jericho, the fortifications of Mycenae, the great defensive works of Mesopotamian cities. The Minoans did not. This could mean several things. It could mean that they relied on their naval power for protection, that their fleet made invasion difficult enough that land walls were unnecessary. It could mean that the relative isolation of their island location gave them a security that mainland civilizations did not enjoy. But it could also mean something about their society, about the internal organization of Minoan civilization, whether it was sufficiently egalitarian, sufficiently coherent, sufficiently lacking in the extreme internal inequalities that elsewhere produced rulers who needed to protect themselves from their own people. We cannot know but the absence of Wahlsect, and it is a fact that invites reflection. A civilization that did not feel the need to wall itself in, that built its greatest structures not as fortresses but as self-shared life administrative, religious, economic, artistic centers, open and accessible, that decorated those centers with images of joy and nature and the human body in motion rather than images of conquest and domination. Something different was happening on Crete, something worth remembering, the peaceful civilization. The Minoans are sometimes called the first peaceful civilization in history. This is probably an overstatement. No human society is entirely without conflict. And the evidence from Minoan sites includes some depictions of warfare and some signs of violence. But compared to their contemporaries, compared to the militaristic cultures of the ancient Near East and the Mycenaean Greek world, the Minoans do seem to have organized their society around different priorities. Art rather than war, trade rather than conquest, beauty rather than power. Their legacy is not a list of military victories or conquered territories. It is the frescoes on the walls of Knossos, the marine-style pottery in museums around the world, the tiny carved seal stones that still astonish with their precision and life. The memory, preserved in Greek mythology, of a golden age on a beautiful island. They were not perfect. No civilization is. We cannot know what was hidden beneath the beautiful surface, what suffering, what inequality, what violence we simply cannot access because the evidence has not survived. But they were remarkable, and they were real, and they were here, building and painting and sailing and celebrating and worshipping their goddess and leaping over bulls. For 1,000 years. 1,000 years of beauty. Coming back to now. What remains? The island of Crete is still there. The olive trees are still there, some of the ancient wild olives that the Cretan landscape are genuinely old. Though not quite for 1,000 years, the mountains are still there. The sea is still that impossible blue. Knossos. The ruins of the great palace rise from the low hill that Arthur Evans first excavated in 1900. You can walk through the restored corridors. You can stand in the central court where the bull leaping may have taken place, under the same Mediterranean sky that the Minoans watched. You can see, in the museum in Heraklion, the frescoes and the pottery and the golden jewelry and the tiny carved seal stones. They are still beautiful. Across for 1,000 years, the beauty has not faded. In museums across the world, in Athens, in London, in Paris, in Boston, Minoan objects sit in glass cases and people stop before them and feel something. Something that crosses the distance of millennia and touches something in the viewer that does not depend on knowing the history, on understanding the context. Pure aesthetic response. Beauty recognizing beauty across for 1,000 years. That is the Minoan legacy, not empire, not military glory, not a religion that conquered the world. Just the persistent, remarkable, apparently inexhaustible beauty of what they made. The writing we cannot read. Somewhere in the undeciphered linear tablets in the archives of the Palace of Knossos, in the administrative records of Phaistos and Mollia and Zakros, there are words we cannot hear. Perhaps inventories, lists of olive oil and grain and wool, the prosaic record-keeping of palace administration. But perhaps other things too, perhaps prayers, perhaps the names of the goddess, perhaps, who knows, something closer to poetry, something that expressed what it felt like to be alive on that beautiful island, in that civilization, in that moment before everything changed. We will probably never know. Linear may never be deciphered if the Minoan language truly has no surviving relatives. The words may be locked away forever behind a script we can see but not hear. And yet, the Minoans found other ways to speak to us. The fresco of the dolphins, the octopus on the marine-style jar, the tiny carved agate showing a bull in mid-leap, its body extended, power and grace frozen in stone for 1,000 years. These are a language too, a language of beauty, and we can read it perfectly. Let the island come to you now, gently as you drift towards sleep. The warm stone of a palace courtyard still holding the heat of the day as the sun goes down. The sea, visible through a doorway, turned gold and rose in the evening light. Somewhere, the sound of a lyre, simple, unhurried notes falling into the quiet air. The smell of wild thyme and salt. The sound of the sea, endlessly patient, endlessly present. Somewhere in those rooms, 4,000 years ago, a woman painted dolphins on a wall. She mixed her pigments with care. She applied them to wet plaster with a brush made from some animal's hair. She painted the curve of a dolphin's back, the arc of its leap, the way the water catches the light. And then she went home, or to sleep, or to whatever came next in the day of a Minoan artist in the palace of Knossos, in the height of a civilization that did not yet know it was dying. The dolphins are still there, still leaping through the same blue water she painted, still beautiful, still full of the life she put into them. You are here, warm and heavy and drifting. The day is done. The night is long and safe and yours. The Minoans built beauty for 1,000 years. You can rest for one night. Let your breathing slow. Let the images soften, the blue sea, the dolphins, the warm stone courtyard, the evening light on the mountains of Crete. Let it all become gentle and distant, like a dream you are moving toward. The island is there. It will be there when you wake. And the dolphins are still leaping. Sleep well.